This is House Planning Help episode 164. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guests are Belinda and Paul Wilson. They share their self-build journey and they've only just moved into their home. I think they've been in there around about a week. We also focus on the role of principal designer because that's something that Paul took on himself, and it's not something we've explored on the podcast. You may not have even heard of it and what it means. So that's what we're digging into in today's podcast. Quick report on my own self-build because we've received our initial sketches back from our architect. Obviously a very exciting moment, and to me it's just fascinating how that discussion, a couple of hours long and obviously putting some things on a couple of sheets of A4, can then translate into sketches of the house. And then, as Chris I think said at the time, it's how good that discussion is as to how well it gets translated, and we were very impressed with the overall look of the building that they came up with. I will share this in due course. Very rural, barn-like, got lots of light coming into it. We loved the upstairs layout. Downstairs it was much more of a challenge, and that's something I'm sure we should cover this in depth about how you feedback when there are things that you need to change. What's the best way of doing it? Because it's all too easy to say, well, I tell you what, I'm going to be a designer here and to start sketching around. Or is that really useful? I don't know. Being in a creative industry for some time, I know what this is like, that there's a line somewhere, I'm not sure where it is, where you don't want to step over and get prescriptive, but you also want to influence and feedback in the right way so that everyone's still enjoying this process. Really impressed so far, and let's hope we can just keep on making progress and pushing things along, even though the house sale is a little bit of a scary one at the moment. Hopefully we can find a buyer soon. Let's get to our featured interview with Belinda and Paul Wilson. Thank you to Alan Budden from Eco Design Consultants for connecting me here. We always love a case study on the podcast, and there will be many more in future. So this is a case study, but a little bit more because Paul's background is in construction, and that led him to take on the principal designer's role, which is perhaps not what you might think it is unless you know about it already. It's more health and safety. So we discuss exactly what it means, the skills a principal designer might need, and also whether it's something that we could consider ourselves, that we could become our project's principal designer. So let's get started. I asked Belinda about when they'd first come up with the idea of building their own home.
When we decided our almost acre plot was not what we wanted to spend the rest of our lives maintaining. A beautiful garden, beautiful lawn. We've got lovely views, lovely aspect, and we wanted to stay in the village where we know lots of people. And so we decided, well, why don't we rip up the tennis court and the herbaceous borders and build a house?
Was this always an idea even when you bought that initial house or adapted that initial house?
It was always in Paul's mind. Always, I think that, we wouldn't need it. We wanted the tennis courts and that when the children were young, but we really knew that there was opportunity, but we did think that there might be planning issues, but it was too early to worry about those, and we bought the house anyway.
How did it first begin then? When was the trigger of now is the time?
I retired, so we'd got sort of time on our hands. It had been in our minds, as Belinda said, and that we had been thinking about what sort of thing we would like, how would we sort of create our dream house. We had done a large extension of the existing house, and that had gone extremely well, and we really enjoyed living in the space that we'd created. But there were lots of compromises in there because circulation was not good, and so it was sort of the idea of having a clean sheet was a real sort of challenge, and we started sort of sketching things out about 3 years ago and talked to an architect, moved forward with that, and then unfortunately didn't get planning permission for the first building that we had designed. But in talking to the planners, they were reluctant to let us build, but said basically that if it was very subservient, if it was sunk into the ground and had some feature to it, and we said in that conversation, I said, what do you mean, what if we were to go green? And there was no sort of real assent to that, but it was actually sort of half a nod towards it. And from there on, we started looking at it. Now, Belinda had always had an interest on that more environmentally friendly approach. I've been always very much more practical and pragmatic, and if it made sense, it had to make money sense as well. And I think ultimately what we realised was actually the two could come together, and that we felt as we started to look around. And I think one of the best things that we did in those early days, we actually spent over that sort of first 2 years, we probably went to 3 or 4 exhibitions every year, grand designs, and there's a house builder one as well, isn't there?
Home building and renovation?
Yeah.
Home building and renovation. So we've been to Birmingham, we've been to the Excel. We've just thoroughly enjoyed that part of the process. It's a great day out. And you get bombarded with ideas. And that's just so good for, that we were able then to sit down with our architects and talk about those ideas that we'd seen. So we were looking at schemes with basements, and it's probably a regret that I didn't get the chance to do the basement. Our daughter lives in Germany. Everywhere there has a basement. It creates fantastic space. And at one of the exhibitions, we came across a company called Glatar. The chap that we met was superb, and we really got on well with him. And we came across him then about 3 occasions at other shows, and we chatted to him each time. And he sort of gave us some ideas, which ultimately we didn't follow through with. I think another thing that we sort of started off with as well was the idea we would buy a kit house. And in particular, we worked with Hansa House. And again, it was quite convenient. With our daughter living in Germany, on one of our trips over to Germany, we went over to the factory, the Hansa House factory. We had a guided tour of the factory. We had a look around the showroom. And it's all very, very impressive. When we sort of got the idea of the house that we wanted in mind with a new architect, Alan Budden of Eco Design, we realised that with a kit house, you almost have to sort of design it twice. So you come up with the concept, you then hand it to them, and they come back to you with a firm price and a new design according to how they want to build it. And that we felt was a bit restrictive for us. The other thing that they wouldn't do was take on the responsibility for the ground and all of the costs associated with, let's say, the vagaries of getting the site ready. We are on a very sloping site. We needed to dig the building into the ground. So it was quite a consideration for us to have a way of dealing with the groundworks and the external works in a way that was going to be cost effective and that we would end up with something that we were happy with. And let's say if you're working with a standard kit house company, they shy away from that, the uncertainty perhaps around the groundworks. And so that pushed us then into a different route. And I have to say that we spoke to a couple of frame companies, and it was only when we spoke to MBC, an Irish timber frame company, who do all of the slab for their own building, that we actually I got the comfort that I wanted from an earthworks and groundworks point of view, and the foundations, that they stood over their foundations. And of course, by them putting their timber frame on their concrete foundation, took a lot of the risk out for us. The last thing we wanted to do was to be a few millimetres out and be held responsible for whatever works were necessary to put it right. That was all down to them.
Belinda, just rewinding for a moment, how did you want to live in this new house?
A driving force for me was to live free. I didn't want to pay for fuel. We were paying $2,300 and more to heat and live in our 2,600 square foot 1930s retrofitted house. And the sun is there. We go backwards and forwards to Germany, as Paul has said, and solar and PV, photovoltaic, are the way forward in Germany. Building materials that they use over there are for the future, and it's got to be the way we all should be going. I saw on YouTube Alan Budden describing in quite he's shy about it, but it's quite an amateur, but it really got the point about the ceiling of a passive house. What is a passive house? Then we started looking at that. So I think the first thing was to build a house where we were not reliant upon, in going into the future and getting older, we're both in our 60s, we wanted to live in a comfortable, warm, healthy environment. That's another thing about passive houses, is the air is filtered because as it's coming in. And we, again, looked at lots of different interviews with people on YouTube. So I think we wanted to live in a very easily maintained I trusted Paul implicitly because of his background in construction, but high spec, we were prepared, weren't we, to push the boat out and we've got beautiful windows. Paul insisted on that, beautiful doors, because this is it. This is the one I should be carried out in either wicker or wool casket in. And so that's why we wanted to build it. And then we wanted what we wanted, and our architect was so flexible and really got to know us very quickly and would even say, Belinda won't like that, or no, Paul won't go with that. Even when we sat down with 2 or 3 concepts, we were very clear, and they asked us, Paul did a brilliant thing, I thought, which was like how we use different areas of our house in a bubble chart. What areas of the house do we use in a day, in a week, in a month, and how do they relate to each other? And then the house had to come up with that. And the principles were, I love cooking and I love plants and garden. We love nature, so I wanted a permaculture fruit garden, ponds for wildlife. I wanted to, as I say, generate as much power as humanly possible, so we do. We've got 91 solar panels, PV panels, sorry. And the equipment that we bought and the showers and the toilets, we weren't going to go rainwater harvesting. Paul's got a view on that, and I think that's bang on, really. We don't want to be guinea pigs, but we do want to embrace what people are using successfully at the moment in this eco environment that we found ourselves in when we decided to go down that route, really.
You have talked a little bit about Paul's unfair advantage site. I think we should declare it here.
Yeah, I'm a chartered surveyor, so over 40 years in the construction business. Became managing director of a 400 million turnover construction company. We did a few houses, but they were generally bespoke, big several million pounders rather than the smaller, let's say, housing projects. So it was a lot of hotels. So my background and the responsibilities that I held, in particularly in terms of managing design, managing progress, managing financials, and managing health and safety, were obviously critical in the way, let's say, that I've grown up and developed as a person, and my expectations for when we come to build our own house. So, yes, I've got that sort of background to me. So it doesn't make it any easier, I think, actually, that when you start to look at these things from a personal point of view, they're entirely different. And you want to, it's almost, I sort of let my background come into it naturally rather than sort of think specifically that I'm acting as a QS here or I'm acting as a project manager. I'm just me, but it just sits there in the background. So I think that some of the concepts would come easier to me than they do to others. I do feel, though, that there's an incredible amount of help on the internet, and certainly the more you read, the more you get. And I can't emphasize enough, visiting these grand designs and these types of shows, engage with the people that are on the stands, and you will get so much information. The best time to go is early in the morning. Don't go late in the afternoon when the crowd, everybody's tired and fed up. Go early in the morning and talk to the people on the stands. We've got some fantastic information. And if you're a novice, and even for us as not novices in construction, the building centre in Swindon, I don't know whether you've come across that, Ben, is a superb place to visit, because you walk around that and you get to see every aspect of the construction from the ground up, and you see all of your options. And I think that's important to get your head around all of the issues that you're going to come across. And I think probably I would get more involved, or I've been able to get more involved in the process in terms of deciding levels and deciding forms of construction or where we've had issues. But I think that if you've got that, you do need to sort of look at it and research some of it yourself to get yourself in the position where you've got the knowledge to be able to have a conversation on a level playing field with somebody. And certainly, let's say from Belinda's point of view, Belinda knows now far more about the construction process from being involved in it. But it, as I say, can't emphasise enough, visiting the shows, having the conversations and doing the research puts you in a really good position.
Belinda, in terms of defining roles, I sometimes find this with my wife. Obviously, Paul's got a lot of knowledge, but Did you have to work hard to make sure that you've got your input, or any tips there?
Not really. We have actually really enjoyed this whole process. We've been in a fortunate position that we can stay living in our current house while we did this job. I was prepared to be in a site van. It wouldn't have, would have done that with the dogs. It's just the two of us. It's fine. I think I didn't really hardly come onto the site because, other than if I would have been required as a first aider, because I went and did a 4-day first aid at work qualification, and so did Nick, because when Paul became principal designer, you have to have, you're obviously looking after several people on site and you have to be there. We took it in turn. So if I was away, we knew that Nick would be there as first aider. So that was a very key role of mine. I didn't get a lot of choice in that. I was just told, by the way, you're going to be the first aider, but I have done first aid before, but not first aid at work. So there was that was my role, making sure there was loo roll and hand towels and things. And that sounds a really I'm not dumbing down, but that is important. I look at the lads and I think they're working on your home, in your area, and the least you can do is to make sure that they've got what they need to be comfortable. It's just, not rocket science. So lots of people provided their own coffee, tea and things like that. But I found that quite a responsible job, and I was appreciated for it. And I think you get good work from people when you look after them. Paul is just, again, I think he doesn't realise his natural ability to choose the right things for the job, because I've got a very low boredom threshold, so a light to me is a light. However, Paul will get the catalogues and he spreadsheets everything, and he goes, no, well, we can do this here and do that there, and I let him do all the due diligence, and I go, that sounds lovely, darling, and that's what we have. Because invariably, if he does say to me, would you like that? And I say, no, could we have this? There's a reason why we can't have what I want. So my role has been to sit back really. And again, I can't say enough about Nick Hull, our builder. I've lived in a building site when we did our 1930s building. The manners of the men, their respect for each other's trades, the way they worked, the way they left the site when they left the site, the way they communicated with us and with Paul, we felt respected and we respected them. I've been involved. We've had 11 homes in our married life, and each of them we've done work in them. And I think to have somebody you trust and to see, manners between the men and respecting each other is a really, really helpful thing to have to make the whole thing feel a lot better. So my role really, the odd bacon butty was brought out on a tray for the lads and they enjoyed that. But I was very involved with Alan Budden and Eco Designs, and they did respect both of our opinions on that, didn't they? So in the I don't like that living space like that. Originally, we were going to have the downstairs bedroom because, as I say, this is where we want to grow extremely old and decrepit in, and so we wanted to have a wide doors so that we could, if need to be, have a wheelchair. We've had elderly parents that we've looked after, and that's important. And so we were working on the fact that the downstairs bedroom, we would live downstairs, and the 2 elevation part of the house would just be for the children and grandchildren when they visited. And we could not get everything in our dream scheme of the walk-in wardrobes and the beautiful big shower room and so on downstairs, and everybody was struggling with it. And then all of a sudden I said, why are we going downstairs now? We're not in our dotage, let's go upstairs. And the minute we did that, we went back to Alan and he said, right, so I think I'm outside the box and very practical and very function not form. Where is my washing line going? And I'm not walking past that machine to get to the washing line. Alan, can you move it please? So that sort of thing. But no, the whole construction, Paul did all the procurement, all his spreadsheets. He's got the spreadsheets and that sort of housekeeping that Paul's done on the finances and the procurement and also the evidence that's required for the Passivhaus certification. Paul has built that up as he's gone along because that's the sort of person he is. So really, I think I would say you built the house. He says, no, you helped. But it was peripheral, really.
Everyone has to utilise their skills, don't they? And I think I could well be cooking the bacon butties on our project. So we covered a lot of ground there, though. You did mention early on about the principal designer role, and that was actually something that I wanted to focus in on, largely because Alan gave you a really good report here. So first of all, what is the principal designer's role, Paul?
It's not as it sounds. It's actually taking the full responsibility for the health and safety of the site in its construction phase. You'd think that as the principal designer that it is all around the design, but it's not. It's making sure that the adequate information is there on site. But the key part of it is making sure that the health and safety process is followed as it should be on the site. And I'm very careful about the words that I use. And certainly in my experience as a sort of being responsible for health and safety in a large company, then you have to have sort of standard roles and procedures that are followed, and that you want those to be followed come what may. Having said that, I think that on a project like this, we were a borderline really as to whether we should notify the HSE or not. I chose that we should, because I felt you could have argued, had there been an accident, you could have argued that we should have been we should have notified. Therefore, I felt that we should. But I also felt that it would put us all on our mark in terms of the quality of management and health and safety management in particular that we were going to follow. And it meant that we got off to a good start. So part of the responsibility of the principal designer is to ensure that the contractor or contractors are doing what they should from a health and safety point of view. And so one of the aspects of that is making sure that inductions are happening. You don't have to do the inductions. You are making sure that they've happened, that the people on site are adequately trained for the responsibilities that they're carrying. Essentially, you're watching to make sure that other people are doing their job. But I think in having the role, that you become involved in the process. And what I realised was I couldn't apply the big company rules to health and safety the way that I would have done on a site when working with the company that I did. We had some particular pinch points around the site, particularly when we were digging the drainage out to the main road. And effectively, we're on one side of a hill and the drains are the other side of the hill, which meant we had to go through the hill, and we had over sort of 2.5 meters depth of a drainage trench. Now, I could have just let the contractor get on with that, but I insisted that we talked about how we did that, and that the method statements, and builders at the scale that we employ, or generally employed on one-off housing developments, are not the people who write method statements in any great detail. They are not the people who do risk assessments. What you have to do is approach it in a practical way, and this is, I think anybody can do this, is to assess what you're doing and look at what the risks are associated with it. So digging a great big deep trench right the way across the entrance to the site, or along the entrance to the site, meant that for 3 days we didn't do anything else on the site. There was no way was I going to let anybody else try and get past that excavation to come onto the site. But all of this I agreed with Nick and with the ground worker. We then worked out a safe way of working that, well, I won't go into the detail, but essentially that I was very happy that this was that the way in which they were laying the pipe and how they were working in the trench, that we effectively over-excavated and then just backfilled as we were going. So it meant that we needed 2 machines, one each side of the excavation, 2 dumpers, one each side of the excavation, so that you could actually sort of pull the pipe down through across the hill and along a very narrow drive as you were going. But you needed to have sort of planned it well in advance and have your machinery and equipment on both sides of the excavation, because you could have got isolated. You couldn't do it from one side. So just as an example, that was key. But it comes down to things like wearing high vis and wearing hard hats and wearing proper shoes. Every person who came onto the site, right up to the very end, was inducted onto the site so that they were aware of where the toilet was, where they could get a cup of coffee, where they could wash their hands, which is the basic stuff. But as well, the 3 basic rules were hard hat, high vis, and protective boots. And that continued right the way through to the end. Now, we did relax the hard hat, and again, in the middle of the summer, if it's baking hot, and the guys are actually struggling with, they're sweating and they would prefer to wear just a cap, provided there's nothing going on over their heads, and there's nowhere that they're going to actually hit their head, then I don't see any reason why you should relax that rule. But it's the balance. The minute that somebody then starts to pick something up, and we had cranes here on a number of occasions, the minute somebody's working overhead, then I insisted that hats went back on again. I think particularly the one thing that is important is high vis. I think that when you've got machinery moving, even if it's only vans, to have a high vis, people are aware of it very quickly. It's not a luxury. It's not an imposition. It is simply, it makes people visible. And when you walk onto the site or you're driving a machine on the site, you can immediately get in your peripheral vision the high-vis jackets. So there's certain things that you stick with, certain things that you can relax on. So I think that my approach to health and safety is the same as me generally, I think is pragmatic. I would say I probably wouldn't have filled the role exactly as the HSE would define it, but I think that I did it from a practical point of view, and at no time do I feel that the site was risky. You can't avoid risk. The task of the manager and the health and safety manager is to manage the risk and to carry out the works in a way that doesn't put people at risk. So you can have working at height, but you want to make sure that you've got the proper scaffold, that you've got ends on the scaffold, that you've got kickboards on the scaffold. And all of those things are basic requirements that you must insist that are there, because then you can quite confidently get up on a ladder, go up onto the scaffold, and you can trust anybody to be up there because the safeguards are there because it's been done properly.
I think the other thing is we were very, very strict, and we had the signage up there that nobody came on this site without the toe detectors, and they were escorted onto the site. People are very interested and naturally nosy, as I would have been, and they'd love to come and pop in and to visit. And this was a no-go area. And when you ask how involved was I in the build, from the kitchen window, I saw a lot what was going on. I whistled, I can do a good wolf whistle, and Paul and I mobiled each other. But I didn't just mince down the path or climb over the wall and come onto site. This is a working area. We paid for a health and safety advisor to come in to do the initial inspection to see if we'd set up correctly, and he was very pleased, got lots of brownie points for that. But I think because you knew that he could come in at any time just to keep us on our toes, and that's part of the principal designing role, isn't it, to have these inspections. When people would ring and say, oh, could we just pop in? I would say, look, I'm really sorry, but after 4:30, when everybody's off site, you can. But even then, Paul would say, and you must wear sensible, either ideally toe detectors. You know, we still maintained that respect for keeping people safe, because it would have been our living nightmare for anybody to have an accident on this site. And thank God they didn't.
Just going back to what you actually have to do for this, how much is on paper here in the office versus being eagle-eyed of what's going on site?
Started off with doing an awful lot of paperwork. So the method statements and risk assessments, the induction process, making sure that everybody has been inducted, that they sign a form to say that they've gone through that induction, that they understand the risks associated with what they're doing. All of that takes some time. That with some of the contractors, it is extremely difficult to get that paperwork out of them. If you don't get it before they start, you've got no chance of getting it. And most of them, at the level at which, as I say, domestic house building, most of them have never done it before. It's only just in fact, it's now probably coming up to 18 months ago that the HSE brought domestic housing into the whole remit of the health and safety rules for construction sites and the notification requirements as well. So this need for paperwork hasn't been sort of taken on board yet by the smaller builders. But I think that the way that I interpreted it was too big a step to go to the whole process immediately. With the contractors that we were using, they simply could not make that step. They don't have the resources, and they do not have the processes that sit behind them, or the people that sit behind an organisation that can type up a risk assessment and can look and think and talk it through and get the balance right. What we needed to do was to make sure that anybody who was coming onto the site, and this is what we agreed with Nick, anybody coming onto the site had to show that they understood what their job was, that they understand the risk associated with that job, that they understood the pressures associated with in terms of the production of that job and their relationship with other contractors. If you can get that straight, then I think that you're meeting the requirements. I think technically you're not, because it's all supposed to be paper checked and counter-checked and all the rest of it. But I think that the practicality of it is the relationship that you have with the men on site is what's important. And if you are unhappy with what they're doing, you tell them. If you're happy with it, then you encourage them. But the key is when they first come onto the site is making sure that they understand what they're doing and they understand where they fit into what else is happening on the site. If you can get that right, and certainly working with Nick made that a lot easier. Nick was certainly on the ball in terms of his relationship with his men, and we were able to sort of build the building without any undue worries, I think, in terms of health and safety.
I think there was humour on the site, but there was never... I think the noisiest part of anything that we had done was when we had one particular utility company down a hole in the road at the front, and we could hear the party that was going on in the trench in the back garden. But, I think we were lucky. I think, actually, what the principal design role that you took on, Paul, and the training that you got, which wasn't terribly alien to you anyway, you were with architects that day, you were with other people that were going to be... But it's like when I did my health and safety first aid at work, when I did the 4-day first aid at work, there was a huge cross section of people there, some people who'd never done first aid in their lives and others who were just training, but we all learned from each other. But what I think it did was to sort of formalise and give a forum for people to know that a conversation could and would be had if they weren't actually fitting in correctly.
One final question on this, and then we'll move on. And that is, how would you assess it or advise someone else if they're thinking, well, I could do this on my self-build. I know I could save some money going down this route. Often the architect will provide this service for a fee. So what am I going to make this decision upon?
I think that I wouldn't be frightened by it. I'd definitely do the CITB course that I did. It's only a day. It's held on a pretty regular basis. You might have to travel to go. I went to Nottingham to do it. Very helpful people on the course. It was quite interactive, and it's essentially it shows you the background to the legislation. The legislation is enormous. There is so many aspects to it. You are expected to know some of that. But it is all available to you on the internet. It's all available to you there. Certainly, I felt that I had the skills to do it without paying a fee for it. I think that anybody who'd been in a management position should be able to do the same. I don't think you need specific construction expertise. And you certainly pay an architect quite a lot of money to carry out that role. Because if an architect is doing it from a distance, he is going to have to do the paperwork exercise and to make sure that everything is ticked and all the T's are crossed and I's dotted. I think that from my point of view, that I felt that wasn't necessary, although we have got lots of paperwork associated with it, but it's not as full as it perhaps could have been.
Were you the project manager on this too?
Effectively, yes. I think that probably... We started off that I was the principal contractor, and Nick, the builder, and the subcontractors that we employed effectively were working under me as the principal contractor. When I became the principal designer, Nick became the principal contractor. So we had a shuffling of roles, but it didn't actually change anything in the way that we were working. And I think that in overall terms that I was the project manager. Certainly, I think one of the things that is key when you're doing a build like this is two aspects to it. One is that information is key, is having the people coming to the site with the right information. So freezing designs is critical. So you don't want several versions of the same drawings floating around. So dimensionally, you want them all to be the same. And the other is progress. One of the key things for me is that we set out with a program very early on, back at probably Christmas time, and I set the program then, did a rough program, and I more or less understood. I then, when we introduced Nick to the scheme, I went through it with him. We agreed on the dates, and we agreed that on certain critical dates when things would happen. The bit that I did that kept everybody on their toes was when I said that the frame is coming, that's the day that everybody worked to for the frame to come. When the windows were coming, I could have compromised everybody, particularly around windows, and then the mechanical plant. That was another date that, again, we could have compromised. but I wouldn't compromise. That's where I put my pressure, making sure that we were ready for each stage. So the roof had to be in on a certain day, the windows had to be in on a certain day, and not allowing compromises around that. So even the frame company, they had more or less finished, but they hadn't quite finished, and they'd got another job to go off to. But I was quite confident in saying, or let's say, it gave me the authority to say, no, you can't go until you finish this, because I've got the roofers coming in on Monday. And they worked the weekend to make sure that that happened. And that single-mindedness around keystone dates is critical to make sure that the progress happens.
Just as we get towards a close here, I know there's lots more we can ask about, but you've done this a number of times in terms of moving up in what you've done with different buildings, but this is your first self-build. So how has it been? What do you feel you've learnt? And what's it like at the end of the process?
It's been enjoyable. I said that earlier. I have been very blessed with the fact that Paul, this is not so terribly alien to him. In fact, I think it's a bit of a dream come true, is to have a blank canvas and not have to fight for the plot, to deal with the planners. To be able to design your own house, I think somebody would want to buy this house, because I think we're quite practical in the way we use this space. So I think it's still a commercial building. We would sell it to somebody who would like to live as we do. No, I just think that the whole thing, we can't believe it. Here we are. It's just 7 months down the line. Here we are. So I just think it's wonderful. And when we get to completion on our other house that we've moved out of, almost nearly in here completely, then we've definitely ticked the box and we've done it. We've done what we set out to do. But at the time, actually, you don't think about it. You've got to keep going. It's steps. And, I think, different members of our family haven't seen us for 7 months and they wondered what on earth we're doing. Well, they haven't been down to see what we've been doing. And when they come for lunch on Saturday, they're going to get a bit of a surprise, I think.
Not being allowed on site without their hard hat. And I know that's clearly, again, your area, your expertise, but keeping things to budget, any tips there to pass on?
I think be practical about your expectations. Nick had a phrase, basically, that whatever you're looking at is going to cost you £40 a square metre. Some of it costs more, some of it costs less. But if you're generally estimating, then you don't sort of pick up. If somebody says, I can get something done for £20 a square metre or £26 a square metre, actually, it isn't that. There are so many peripherals that you have to consider that go into it. And I would say definitely you should be upping rates that you're given by 10 to 15% for a budget. When you go into procure, you take that contingency out. We started off with a 6% contingency and we spent it all, but mostly on the ground. I did actually, I should admit it, as a quantity surveyor, I did actually make a mistake in the quantities of the groundworks, and that was left a sort of a £7,000 hole in our contingency. But because I'd budgeted for everything else the way that I've just mentioned, with plenty of contingency in it, that it meant then that we bought well within those numbers. And so we saved right the way through all of the trades except for the external works and groundworks, and then ultimately spent virtually to a couple of £1,000s over the budget when we started off. I think if we'd to have the time again, the uncertainties around groundworks and pinning people down that's the most difficult part of it. And certainly what we did, and I probably would have done more of it, is have a separate contract to get that sorted out before you start the build. And then at least you know what you're dealing with. You end up then with a prepared site. Now, because we are 70 metres from the road, and we've got an issue from access point of view anyway, and that's what created the issues for us in terms of the excavation and the cost associated with that. But I would say at the end of the day, plenty of contingency, stay on top of everybody in terms of their billing. I always pay when asked. Don't try and get credit, because you ultimately, if you get a name for being tight with paying out the cash, then actually you will get a loaded bill when it comes. It's a false saving. Cash is the lifeblood of these small contractors, and you are more likely to get a better deal if you're paying cash. But don't be afraid either to negotiate. People like the windows, the roof, everybody will actually give you discounts. So if you suggest 5-10% off the cost of windows, no problem, play one off against the other. But as soon as you're in contract, that's it. Work to that figure. But equally, as long as you're not pushing them down, you don't expect them to push you back up again.
Well, thank you so much for being very generous with all of the information today. Really enjoyed the chat. Paul and Belinda, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/164. You can review the key points from today's discussion, also look at some photos from the construction of their home. And also, if you've got a comment or perhaps you'd like to ask a question, just scroll down to the bottom of the show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/164. Let's finish up on a hub update, and we've held our latest progress call where I actually shared the initial sketches from my project with the group and got some feedback because, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we're just trying to refine the design downstairs, and it's very difficult when you haven't been through this before to know how to do that exactly and what feedback you should be providing so that you're not wasting any time. And it was just a really interesting discussion, so that's now up in the hub. Also, we've got our second video on the basement construction from Buckinghamshire Passivhaus. This is our in-depth video case studies that we do, our second one that we're on now, and then my own project will be the third one. So we're complete in the basement except for the backfill. I think that will go into the next episode. There's also a new module on buying land. What exactly are you going to go through? If you haven't been through the process, really helpful, step by step, trying to alert you exactly what the solicitors need, what you need to do on your own, and everything we've jammed into that module. 3 reasons you might consider becoming a hub member if you're not already. One of the key ones, I think, actually is the loneliness aspect of it, that sometimes it can feel like you're the only person going through this. You don't know who to speak to, even if it's about something trivial. So definitely becoming a hub member, we put an emphasis on the community in there. And also, second point, actually, if you've got a quick question, sometimes you might even know the answer yourself, but just be looking for a bit of confirmation. Well, the forum's a really good place to put that question in there. And finally, it's a place to continue the learning. We've talked about the in-depth video case studies and the modules and the progress calls. It all links together, hopefully to keep you on track, just trying to understand the decisions you're going to have to make so that when it comes to that time, you can make them well and hopefully not fall into any of the traps. So our current enrolment window is closed, but be first to find out when it's going to reopen. Get yourself on the VIP early bird list, and you can do that at houseplanninghelp.com/join. There we go. Done for another session. Thanks for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.